Well, thank you. Good morning. Welcome to the 4th Housing and Development Summit. Today, we are very thrilled to have Chuck Marone back from Strong Towns to talk about transportation planning and traffic engineering. Last night, we had an awesome walking tour, as we always do. It was at Southern Village with Dr. Bryan, and he explained a lot of the community building aspects of the planning that went into that community. We also saw some really interesting to me transportation infrastructure engineering that was allowed, like 15% grade coming down to a stop sign. You know, that kind of stuff gets shot down right and left, but it really does. In this case, it really helped create a streetscape that fosters a lot of community, and we saw a lot of kids playing in the parks and people walking their dogs, and it was shocking to me how many neighbors just came out of their house just because like we were walking down the street. That was a really cool, just kind of tangible aspect when you design a community thoughtfully and when you're allowed to design a community thoughtfully like that. So we're talking about traffic engineering and transportation. Just real quick, how many people here took public transit to get here this morning? Mayor Williams, yeah. All right. Yeah. It was a really nice temperate morning. How many people biked or walked to get here? Hey, it's like not even fair for you, Aaron. I mean, come on. Well, that's great. And then, how many people drove here and needed to find parking? So, this is pretty indicative of our region. We're about 98%, 98.5% car dependent as a region. And, we're just a little small sample size of that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I also want to acknowledge that, we've got a pretty big national event coming up in November. Might cause some tension around the family. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's in a month. So I just want to start off in the spirit of Thanksgiving with some gratitude. Grateful for the HBA, DOC, Holly, Julie, Selena. Appreciate everyone that allows this event to happen. Thank you to Mayor Williams, Leo. Appreciate your help in getting the venue. It's really cool to be here this morning. And we're, last but not least, very grateful for Chuck Marone and Strong Towns and all of the conversations that are happening around the YIMBY movement, Strong Towns movement. A lot of good momentum in the country right now, so grateful for that. And with that, I will invite Chuck up here and we'll get started. Thank y'all.
So I received this invitation to be here, and last time I was invited, it was such a great experience, a very positive experience. I love Evan and his energy, and I really admire a lot of the stuff that you're working on. So of course, I said yes. This is my 9th week in a row traveling. I had a book come out last April, and so this is the second leg of the book tour. And today's my last day. I'm going home, and I'm going home for 2 months. So I have to reintroduce myself to my wife and kids and all that. We're going to talk transportation, which is not the current book. And so I actually have to tell you, I circled this date on the calendar because I'm very excited to get into the transportation conversation again. My second book was on transportation, and it's been a little while, but this is a fun topic, and it's a fun topic. I was telling people this last night. There's the Willie Sutton quote where they asked him, "Why did you rob the bank?" And he said, "Because that's where the money is." Why do we focus so intensely on transportation? And the reality is because that's where the money is. We have so many needs when it comes to transportation, right? We have the need to make urgent repairs. We want to deal with congestion. We've got safety issues. We associate transportation investments with growth. The only problem is we just don't have enough money to do all the stuff we need to do. We have so many things that we want to do, so many needs. We have this generation of retirees and near retirees that are asking for something very different from our transportation system than they did a couple decades ago. We have a bunch of young people who are likewise like looking for different things, don't necessarily embrace car culture the way that past generations did. We just lack the money to do all the things and meet all the demands. We've got a whole bunch of investments that we want to make, whether it's investments in transit or biking and walking infrastructure. We've got all kinds of stuff that we would like to do, and we just don't have the money to do it all. What is the obvious answer to all these challenges? We just need more money, right? If we just had more money, we could solve all these problems. We could address all of these things. And if you listen to the conversation that we are having here in this region, in this state, about transportation, if you look at the conversation we're having nationally about transportation, it tends to focus around this idea of how do we get more money to do more of the stuff that we have been doing. The American Society of Civil Engineers, which is kind of the go-to organization for transportation spending, came out with a report a few years back. The report said, we have an annual deficit in transportation spending on maintenance at the federal level. This doesn't include all the state stuff, all the local stuff, just the big federally funded stuff, $94 billion a year. That is how much we need to spend more than what we're spending now. If we look at the federal gas tax is 18.4 cents a gallon. It hasn't been changed since the 1990s. There's a lot of conversation about adjusting the gas tax to inflation. If we did that, if we adjusted it to inflation, it would today be around 30 cents a gallon. I thought it would be interesting to say, all right, what if we adjusted it based on the increase in traffic? Again, you wind up around that 30 cents a gallon mark. If we grew the gas tax at the same rate as GDP grew, as the growth in our economy was, it'd be a little bit less, about 24 cents a gallon. But if we raise the gas tax enough to cover the maintenance deficit, in other words, just to maintain the federal infrastructure, again, not the state, not the local stuff, we would need a gas tax around 78 cents a gallon. A number that's never going to happen, right? In that same report, the American Society of Civil Engineers said, the longer we fail to invest in basic maintenance of our infrastructure, the more distress our economy is going to experience. In fact, if we don't invest properly in transportation maintenance, this is not expansion. This is just maintaining what we have now. The cost of that inaction over the next decade is going to be $1 trillion of losses to families, to businesses, to the economy. That's $1 trillion of growth that otherwise wouldn't happen. In order to avoid that $1 trillion loss, the American Society of Civil Engineers recommends we spend $220 billion a year over the next decade, or $2.2 trillion. Over the next 30 years, the American Society of Civil Engineers says if we don't spend enough money on infrastructure, our economy is going to grow slower than it otherwise would. In fact, it's going to grow 1% a year less than it otherwise would if we don't make these aggressive investments in transportation infrastructure. If you look at that 30-year period of time and you calculate that out, that comes to a lost federal revenue of $540 billion. It's money that the federal government will not collect that they otherwise would. In order to avoid that loss, the American Society of Civil Engineers says we should spend $6.6 trillion. I can see the look on your face. And you're starting to say, Evan, why did you invite this guy here? These numbers don't make any sense. And I'm going to tell you, these numbers don't make any sense. These numbers are, at their face, ridiculous. And if you want to start recognizing what is going on in our transportation system today, we need to recognize how insane financially what we're doing is. As a window onto this insanity, I want to give you this kind of very intense project out in California, which is now done, by the way. Highway 91 expansion. They went in, added additional lanes to a highway that is already kind of bizarrely wide. Here's how it was reported in the local paper. The project, this Highway 91 expansion, will give some relief to drivers in the regular lanes raising their average rush hour speed from 8 miles an hour to 9.4 miles an hour. $1.2 billion. Now, when I show you these crazy numbers, and you're like, this is insane. Why would anyone say to avoid $1 trillion loss, we should spend 2.2 trillion? This doesn't make any sense. Understand, transportation finance today no longer makes any sense. It hasn't made any sense for decades. These are not positive returning investments. They're deeply, deeply negative returning investments. If you look at this math in and of itself, this project here has an 8-to-1 or a 9-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. The costs are very real. It's $1.2 billion that we're spending. The benefits have no, in a sense, cash equivalent at all. You take the average rush hour speeds of 8 miles an hour and make them 9.4 miles an hour. Here's how engineers deal with that. They will look and say, all right, there's 200,000 people a day who drive this highway on average. We're going to save each of them 30 seconds a day in their commute, theoretically. 30 seconds times 200,000 people times 365 days a year times 50 years that we plan to have this highway in place times $30 an hour, the average salary or wage, hourly wage of a Southern Californian. And all of a sudden, this $1.2 billion investment is saving $5 billion worth of time, aggregated across 30-second increments of society. This is an insane way to value things. Yet this is deeply embedded in how we look at projects like this. So the idea that we need more money is based on the idea that the things we have been doing are working, that the things we have been doing make sense, that the things we have been doing we can continue to do in the same way. And that is not only a fallacy, it is obviously not true. Your own state, and I'm going to say this with kindness, and a bit of Minnesota generosity, your state is one of the worst run departments of transportation in the country. You've seen your own reports about overspending, about bad fiscal management. I was earlier this week in what I think is the worst run DOT. I was in Erie, Pennsylvania earlier this week. I would put you in the top 3, with Pennsylvania being number 1, and then Caltrans and you being in a close second or third race. There's a certain inertia here. What is the next project? What is the next project? What is the next project? With a massive, massive backlog of maintenance and uncared for stuff. I would actually put Tennessee as one of the better ones. And the DOT commissioner in Tennessee made this remark to the state legislature. They said, why would you put an addition onto your house when your roof is leaking? Why don't you fix the roof? That's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be building new stuff. You all have every part of your house leaking, the roof, the plumbing, the sewer system, yet we are putting addition after addition with swimming pools and everything else. It is actually quite insane. Part of what was going to be the thing that the DOTs around the country were relying on to help them bridge these gaps, and just so we're clear, every state in the United States has a massive, massive backlog of maintenance. Every state in the United States has a huge fiscal gap. When they project out, and the state DOTs are actually pretty good at projecting out their needs, the gap between their needs and their projected revenue is multiples of their budget. It's not like there's a 5% tweak or a 10% tweak needed. There's multiple budget increases needed to make this happen. Part of what was going to solve this or deal with this or narrow that gap was the infrastructure bill that was passed during the Biden administration. It's fascinating because we wrote a lot about it at the very beginning. Many of you may not remember, but the original plan was called the American Jobs Plan. And it was sold as, and I'm going to quote because this is right out of the plan, a historic investment in our nation's productivity and long-term growth. We had for years been sold Infrastructure Week, transportation, American Society of Civil Engineers. We need to make all these investments. And year after year after year, we failed to do it. And finally, we were going to have this huge infrastructure investment, this big bipartisan compromise where we were going to invest and do all this catch up and make all of this work. In the American Jobs Plan, right on the front page, it said, we have a massive problem. 1 in 5 miles of our highways and major roads are in poor condition, as well as 45,000 bridges that are in disrepair. This was the front page thing. This is the urgent calling. We have this huge backlog of maintenance, right? If you open up the plan then, on the inside, it says this historic investment, this massive, huge amount of money we're going to spend on infrastructure, the president's plan is going to modernize 20,000 miles of highways and main streets, and it will fix the 10 most economically significant bridges, as well as repair 10,000 smaller bridges. Now, I've just shown you 2 slides with a bunch of numbers, and for those of you that maybe don't remember the number in the propaganda on the first page, this stuff seems like, oh wow, this is a really big investment. Let me show you what the proposed numbers were for the most historic, largest, grandest infrastructure investment we've ever made as a country. Miles of road in poor condition. This is what the American Jobs Plan said we had. This is what the American Jobs Plan proposes to fund. This is the amount of bridges in poor condition that the American Jobs Plan says we have. This is the amount of bridges the plan proposed to fix. This is what was proposed. What was approved was way, 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 way smaller than what was proposed. And not only was that true, that the amount actually approved was way smaller, what do we do with the amount that was approved? What happened when that money flowed out of Washington, D.C. to all the various states in this country? What did the states do with it for the most part? Did they maintain their existing bridges? Did they maintain their existing roads? No. What did you all do? Massive expansion projects. You added new lanes, you added new interchanges, you added new bridges, you built all kinds of new stuff. All these plans that you had on the shelf that you couldn't fund yourselves, you took the federal, one-time federal money that you got and you allocated it towards that. And in fact, what you did is you actually accelerated money that you were going to get in the future to spend today in a way that I want to say your attorney general or what have you took some issue with. Here's the thing that I want us to struggle with, and this is the thing I want you to think about tonight and tomorrow and next month when you're having conversations about infrastructure and transportation spending and what you should be doing as a community. If we don't have the money, what do we do differently? If we don't have the money, what do we do? If we actually can't maintain everything that we built, let alone build everything that we have on our wish list of things we want to build, what do we do then? This is the question I want us to struggle with. To answer this question, what we really need to do is understand how our system has been built and why doing more of the same thing is not only getting us the same negative result, but it's actually getting us worse results now than it would have a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. This is like a sketch of the hierarchical road network. Very, very simple. We all live in this world, so we all understand this system. Small little local streets pour into collector streets. Collector streets pour into arterial streets. Arterials end up in major arterials. Major arterials pour into interstates. We get how this system works, small to big. This is the basis of our current transportation system. If you go to any city that has a transportation plan, that plan is going to have in it a map showing the hierarchical road network and a classification of all the different bits of infrastructure. I want you to think about a watershed. And I'm going to use Minnesota terms, but I'm sure you will know what I'm talking about. You have little ditches and creeks that will flow into streams Streams will flow into like brooks and little rivers. The little rivers will come together to form major rivers. We understand how these systems work, and we recognize that if you get rain out on the periphery, and that rain is intense enough or lasts for long enough, all of that water will come together, and at the major tributary, you will get a flood. We understand this. As a civil engineer, I was taught this. Hydrology 101, we spend about 5 minutes on that because it's such a basic, easy concept. Everybody understands it. For some reason, however, when we leave Hydrology 101 and walk across the hall to Traffic 101, we can look at a very similar system, one not made of water, but one made of concrete and asphalt, and recognize that when it rains a little bit out on the edge, when you get a whole bunch of traffic all at once, or over a persistent amount of time, what you wind up with is a flood. If we set out to create a system to generate the maximum amount of congestion, this is what that system would look like. It would take everybody in an entire region and it would channel them to a few spots at the same time every day. This is why congestion is both unsolvable and a ubiquitous condition across North America. In every city, no matter what size, you have a rush hour. You have a period of peak congestion where everybody is channeled and funneled into the same spots at the same time. My city is 14,000 people. We have a rush hour just like you do. Now, our rush hour lasts for 5 minutes, right? But for that 5 minutes, you can go out there and talk to anyone in their car sitting stuck in congestion and say, what do you think of the traffic here? And they say, oh, it's horrible. We need to add more lanes. We need to add more stuff. We need to do things. This is absolutely unbearable. This is a shared experience across North America. This is something that we all have. Because of this, and because of the general free flowing of capital, again, Willie Sutton, why did you rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. Why did you propose a transportation solution to this problem? Because that's where the money is. What we tend to do as engineers, what we tend to do as a profession is over-engineer, over-design, over-build. I want you to think about this from the user standpoint, from someone driving. If you are driving throughout this region and we have built more transportation infrastructure than is needed, what is your experience as a driver? Well, for the periods of time that there's no congestion, you have free-flowing roadways, free-flowing conditions, ample lane width, ample room. You can move at high speeds. I've driven around here the last couple days. I've been here multiple times and experienced it. You have no congestion, so to speak. You have periods of time where you manufacture a flood, where you create congestion, but for the most part, you have empty streets and empty roadways. We experience it as users as high performance. What happens if we have slightly less capacity than we need? The entire thing just becomes congested and stops. If we're trying to solve all these problems by building more, constructing more, throwing more money at it, there is a huge internal bias to erring on the big. If we think we might need this much, we might as well build this much, because there's no downside to the users to having maximum amount of capacity. No downside to the users except the fact that you actually are going broke and can't afford to maintain the system you've built. That is like a chronic pain that exists in the background, as opposed to the acute pain of being stuck in traffic for a little bit of time. Engineers use an approach to building called forgiving design. It's funny because I've been invited to lecture to different student groups and universities over the last few years, and I do this poll when I'm there. I'm said, can anyone in the room tell me what forgiving design is? They don't teach it anymore. It's just called design. When I'm 51 now, so I'm not old, please. When I was an undergrad in the 1990s, this was taught as forgiving design because the professors were really proud of these sets of insights. It's now passed on as just the way things are done. Forgiving design is this idea that people were dying on our roadways and that we could engineer them to be safer. And the way we would engineer them to be safer is to forgive the mistakes that drivers make, to actually design the roadway so that if a driver makes mistakes, they can, in a sense, recover from that or not have that result in death, tragedy, trauma. Let me show you how this works. If you have a two-lane roadway, traffic going in each direction, we recognize and understand that sometimes drivers will swerve a little bit, right? Maybe you look down to change the radio station, or you're, looking at something on the side of the road. If people swerve a little bit, what we don't want is we don't want them to swerve into the other lane. We want to give them ample room to move so that they don't hit anything. So the first step of forgiving design is to widen out the lane widths, to give people more room to move, right? Now, we know that people driving will sometimes, for reasons that are legitimate, sometimes just a moment of inattention, they will actually go off the side of the road. They'll actually go off the edge of the driving lane. If there's an edge of the asphalt surface, if there's an edge, oftentimes you'll get stuck and your car will get pulled off and flipped or whatever. We don't want that kind of thing to happen. We want people to be able to, if they go off the edge of the road, recover and get back on their way. And so what we do is we widen out that edge. We give them a little bit of recovery room. We also understand that sometimes vehicles traveling along a roadway will exit the roadway entirely. They will leave the driving surface with lots of kinetic energy. We want that energy to dissipate before they run into anything that will not move. And so what we do is we go out and we clear out the trees and the other things. And now we have a forgiving design. We have a design that is deemed to be safe by the engineering profession. The fascinating thing about this is that when we look at the open road, when we look at the interstate system, this is a genius approach. This approach has been copied around the world. It's the gold standard. Like, we really get how to do highways. The thing that is most operative for you, particularly you at the city level, where, the town level, where you've taken on an enormous amount of liability, is that when you build streets like this in an urban area, how do people react to all of this generous design? Yeah, they react by going much, much faster than what conditions would allow. What I see here in in Durham, what I have seen when I have been to Raleigh, what I saw yesterday on the walking tour and in other places, is that we have this tendency to over-engineer, to over-design, to over-perform on our streets. And I'm going to point out two things. We do it at enormous cost financially, and we do it with a huge amount of negative impacts to safety added in. In fact, from an engineering standpoint, there are certain textbooks that we use to kind of dictate how things are to be done. This is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. This is one of the Bibles of the traffic engineering profession. If you go into this Bible and you say, all right, I'm in DR's development yesterday, I want to build a local street, and I want to build a local street which is different than an interstate. What does the manual tell me on how I should build it differently? If you actually look up the definition of a street, it will say street, see highway. We're not adequately discerning between the two. And so what we say to builders, to developers, to engineers, to people who are designing these things is that you need to build them with a highway first mindset. You need to over-design, over-engineer, add extra capacity, add more performance. In places where, as we're walking through the neighborhood yesterday, there's no traffic. And the traffic that's there, we actually want to be at a low performance state. because there's also people walking, people biking, kids playing in the adjacent yards and all that kind of stuff. The irony or the conflict of our transportation system is that we actually, because of safety, or in the name of safety, will over-design and over-engineer our roadways. And so in places where we want people to drive 25, we will, to create a margin of safety, engineer them for 55, mark them at 25 where we want people to drive, and then witness people driving somewhere in the middle. This is not, by the way, a failing of enforcement. It's not a failure of drivers to be responsible. During the pandemic, we saw this massive increase in deaths, even though driving was way down. And it was widely attributed by transportation officials as being correlated with reckless driving, with reckless behavior of humans. I think now we're starting to recognize what design has done. We have built at enormous cost to ourselves some very, very dangerous streets. We have a saying at Strong Towns, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down, you designed the street wrong. The street should actually be communicating to people what a safe speed is. And generally, the way you do that is the opposite of forgiving design. Instead of widening out the lanes, you narrow them up. Instead of adding clear zones and side areas, you bring in the trees, you tighten it up, you create edge friction. We were walking yesterday through the development. I don't remember the name of your beautiful place. Southern Village. I would recommend going there. It's now, in its third decade of development. It's very mature. You'll see what a mature, well-designed place looks like. It is really very quite nice. There was one point where you pointed out a little optical illusion trick you had done, and I thought it was very genius. The optical illusion was the way that these trees were planted, and they were planted to make the walk in one direction look like it was a long walk. The trees were planted here, and they would go out further as you went, and it made it look, it would go in, and it made it look like it was a long ways away that you were walking. And in the other direction, obviously it was going out, it made it look much closer. So when you're on your way to school, it looked like the school was just right there. It was very close because of the way the trees lined up. And you were heading back to the neighborhood, it looked like there was a lot of separation to the neighborhood. It's a little like optical illusion. And it impacts the way you think about walking through that space. It's fascinating because in driving, we have the same thing, right? On a highway, the center stripe, when it's a dash line, will be a certain distance apart. If you actually bring that distance closer together, what do drivers do? They slow down. With no other change in the roadway, they slow down because it feels like they're moving faster, right? When we think about local streets, what we see is that by narrowing up lanes, by tightening up curbs, by changing curb radiuses, by having steeper slopes at times, drivers don't react to that by being crazy people, because very few of us are actually crazy people, right? Very few of us are actually reckless drivers. What they will do is they will respond to that by slowing down. And I'm going to say this because I'm in a room of builders. I get, there's this continual frustration that I get from people who try to develop property and develop it well, because you understand that there's this tension between the quality of the space you are building and the value of the buildings and the development that you're selling, and what the engineers actually require you to do as part of building. Not only will they ask you to do things that cost a lot of money, so more money than what would be necessary to spend, and I get that tension, but they will also require you to do things that degrade the value of what you are building. Understand that this is not only being done in your developments, and in the new places that we build, but this has systematically been done throughout all of our neighborhoods. We have largely turned here in Durham, over the many, many, many decades since World War II that we've been building this way, we have turned neighborhoods that are generally walkable, generally complete kind of successful places into places that are dominated by engineers and automobile design. This is a standard chart from a random engineering manual, but it represents kind of something you will find in a lot of textbooks, a lot of engineering books, explaining the trade-off between mobility and access that you get with different road classifications. And by mobility and access, I mean your ability to get somewhere versus your ability to be somewhere. On the top, you've got mobility. That's your ability to move around real quickly. And on the bottom, you've got land access. That's basically like the quality of your place. And you'll see that in each of those systems, engineers are saying, hey, we've got arterials. That's meant to move you around quickly. We've got local streets. That's meant to be in a place. And then we've got this magical thing in the middle where you can have your cake and eat it too. You can both get around and be in a place. That's the collector. From a fiscal standpoint, what we need to recognize is that we can build great interstates, we can build great highways, great connections between places, and we can do that profitably. We can do that in a way where we connect two places where there's stuff going on, and that connection creates a lot of value between them. Now, adding an 11th and 12th lane, putting in your 8th interchange, these things don't add value, but making that connection between two places creates a ton of value. We also recognize that on local streets, when we narrow up streets, when we tighten things up, we can actually not only spend less on the transportation infrastructure, but what happens is that we get a tax base that is actually worth a lot more. We can start to thicken up our places. We can make them better places, more financially productive. We can do this, again, at a really high profit. And I don't mean a profit for the developer, I mean a profit for the community. It's this part in the middle. It's this stuff in the middle that is extremely expensive to build and has a very, very low level of financial productivity, where we see us spending the majority of our money, the majority of our time, the majority of our efforts today. I want to point out from a safety standpoint, we can also build these very safe. When you're driving down an interstate, per mile traveled, some of the safest transportation in the country. When you're on a local street, you might have fender benders, but there's not a lot of people dying when you're going 10, 15, 20 miles an hour. It's this stuff in the middle where you are going at lethal speeds over 25 miles an hour, under 55 miles an hour, in that kind of zone, where you combine it with a lot of randomness and a lot of complexity, where we see the most fatalities in this country. If you take that chart and you flip it on its side, and instead of functional classification, you put speed at the bottom, and in the vertical, you say value. What I'm trying to ask here is, at what speed do we create the most value for our community? When we're traveling at very low speeds, in other words, when we're on a local street, what we do is we create a platform where you can make great local investments and see a high return on that investment. When you're traveling at really low speeds, that has a ton of value, and the value shows up in the real estate. When you're traveling at really high speeds, you also create a lot of value because you are getting somewhere quickly. You're connecting places, and that has value for the places that you connect. It's this middle part here where you're neither traveling at fast speeds, nor are you creating a lot of wealth, where we see the predominant amount of our transportation investment dollars going, and where we see the least return on those investments. This is an area that we call the STROAD. It's neither street nor road. It is this combination of the two, right? A road is a high-speed connection between two places. A street is a platform for building wealth in a place. A street is the framework for building a place. We call the Strode the futon of transportation, right? A futon is an uncomfortable couch that makes into an uncomfortable bed. A Strode tries to do two things at once. It tries to both move traffic quickly while it also creates wealth, and it fails at both. This is like a typical Strode. This is like a Midwestern Strode. Yours look slightly different than ours do, but they have similar characteristics. You'll see here that we've invested ridiculous amounts of money in moving traffic very quickly, right? You've got 4 highway scaled lanes. You've got a center turn lane designed to get those turning cars out of the way so the through traffic can just flow. Lots and lots of money spent moving vehicles quickly. Does anyone move quickly here? Of course not. We have very low speed limits. We have traffic signals that make you stop for extended periods of time. And so despite the massive amount of investment we've made to move traffic quickly, nobody moves very quickly here. Look at the investments we've made now to make this more of a place. We've put in decorative lights. They put up benches and street plants and that kind of thing, banners on the lights. They put in extra wide sidewalks, some crossings. Is it comfortable to be in this space? Is this space building a lot of value? No, because everybody who is here recognizes that if I'm going to build any kind of store, everybody here is going to arrive by car. And so I need to have a drive-through, a massive parking lot. I need to have things, to service vehicles. And so the development pattern gets very, very spread out. And the amount of private investment that you get per foot of public investment goes way, way, way down. These are negative returning investments. When we think of building a place, what we're really thinking of is, you can think of a barbell as an analogy, right? You've got places and you've got transportation that is connecting them. These are the investments to build a place, the investment to build a transportation. Streets are the framework for building wealth in that place. The road is the connection between the two. The more we can make them more street-like, in other words, we're going to slow things down, create a lot of wealth, create a lot of investment here. The more things we can make them road-like, we're going to speed things up, reduce the amount of investment, get people moving very quickly, no interchanges, no off-ramps. The more we can do this, the more value and wealth we create. I want to talk a little bit about how our development pattern relates to this. Because the transportation system, Willie Sutton, why do we rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. Why do we build transportation projects? Because that's where the money is. We have tended to define success locally in terms of what we can do from a transportation investment standpoint. How much money can we bring in for transportation? How much can we spend? What's the next big project we can do? And how that will create for us growth, development, jobs, economic activity. I want you to understand that relationship, because that relationship is dysfunctional and it's having a lot of negative impacts on not only our society in general, but on the wealth and prosperity of our community. This is my hometown. And I know at this resolution, this photo's a little grainy. It's a grainy photo anyway. This is from 1870. I live in Brainerd, Minnesota, which is a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is the first iteration of Front Street in Brainerd, Minnesota. This was, the first people that moved there. And I show this photo because every city, including this one, that was ever built by humans prior to the Great Depression began just like this. Began as a little collection of shacks, a tiny investment, some hopes and some dreams for the future. A lot of places never got past this stage. They failed before they got to the next stage. All those variables didn't come together. It didn't work out. But there wasn't a lot ventured, so there wasn't a lot lost, right? But when cities were successful, they would grow in a very simple, very understandable, very organic way. And this is a way that we see of cities pre-Great Depression all over the world. They would start to grow incrementally up, they would grow incrementally out, and they would become incrementally more intense. The development pattern would start to mature. As more people would move, land values would start to go up. As land values would go up, the buildings that were there were in decline. They were just starting to age out. These were not just built to last anyway. That combination of rising land values and declining structure quality would create this natural redevelopment pressure where people would find it advantageous to take these buildings and mature them. And so this street would eventually become this street. And as this street continued to grow incrementally, it would grow incrementally out, incrementally up, and incrementally thicken up and become more mature. Front Street in Brainerd would switch from these 2- and 3-story wood structures to buildings of brick and granite. When I come east from my home in the Midwest, when I travel east, what I see and what I experience are cities that were more mature at the end of World War II than my city. There's more stuff that reached this phase and beyond at the beginning of the Great Depression than what you see when I go west. When I go west, and if you ever travel to California, you will see that the development pattern in California throughout is very much like the stuff you have built around your core neighborhoods. But your core neighborhoods retain this historicness because a lot of your growth happened pre-Great Depression. I sometimes have people say, well, okay, Chuck, I get this, but this is kind of cute for a nice Midwestern city. We don't see real cities growing in this way. Let me show you this little square from this town in the Northeast. Here's what it looked like in 1878. Here it is in 1898. I've got a photo from 1911 and another one from the 19-teens. You might recognize that as Times Square. Yeah. Every city in human history started small, tiny, and grew incrementally over time. And there is a kind of maturing process from the very small to the very large that is this kind of iterative way of building. Again, I'm going to go back to my hometown. These images are like the early images of what a city looked like, right? Going from this phase to this phase to this phase. Here's what the street looks like today. Yeah, that's the right reaction. Ugh. I took that photo from about where this photo was taken. This one was taken from up high. I was on the ground, but this is what the street used to look like. This is what the street looks like today. And recognize that we have invested $500,000 in public infrastructure on that little 2-block stretch of street. You add up the street, the base, the drainage, the sewer, the water, the electricity, the sidewalks, the curbs, all that, you're talking $500,000. Where is the wealth that we are going to tap into to sustain that investment? That wealth used to be there, right? It used to be there in spades. It is no longer there. This is the story of what we have done from a transportation standpoint to our development pattern. And it's one of making our cities increasingly financially fragile. Because we've taken places with tremendous wealth and tremendous tax base. And as a result of our transportation investments and the development pattern that we have married to it, we have denuded that tax base while adding an enormous amount of liability with very little comparative tax base on the edges of our cities. Why did we do it this way? At the end of World War II, it was very clear to the economists at the time that when the war ended and we demobilized all these troops and we shut down all these industries of war, that our economy was no different than it was a decade earlier. And that when all these things happened, we were going to go right back into the depths of the Great Depression. That's what the advisors around FDR were worried about. That's what the economists at the time were worried about. The war, and we're taught this today in kind of this bizarre, economist-centric view of American history. We're taught that World War II solved the Great Depression, right? How do we get out of the Great Depression? World War II. Think about that. We were in economic depression. The way we got out of that was to have tens of millions of people die around the world, have families ripped apart, have millions of people go overseas to fight and to kill and to die, to take all the spare capacity that we had in the economy, put it towards building ships and bombs and munitions and all the stuff that we were not going to make any use of. And economists looked at this and said, hey, we solved our biggest problem. Our biggest problem was that our GDP was not growing. Now it is. So when all that was going to come to an end, the economists were freaking out. Like, what do we do now? And what they came up with was what we now call the North American development pattern. They took cities and they turned them into engines of growth. We took all of this capacity we had and we turned it towards building a new version of America. We invested in interstates. We invested in local transportation. We invested in running infrastructure all over the country. We invested in housing programs and commercial real estate programs, and we created secondary markets, and we did all kinds of things to juice growth in the economy. And we made our cities grow, 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 grow in such a way that this is now the default. Whenever we have any economic issues, we default towards doing more of this. Let me show you what this looks like. And I've got a map of Fresno. I'm not using this map because I think you are Fresno, but I think you will see yourself in this map of Fresno. This is the boundaries of Fresno over time. So that yellow box right there is the limits of Fresno in 1897. And I want you to see how this changes, because for a number of years, here's 1909, Fresno grew in that incremental way, right? Incrementally up, incrementally out, incrementally thickening up. Here's the middle of the Great Depression, and here's the end of World War II. You'll note that even during difficult times, even during the Depression, Fresno continued to grow, as did your city. Because that traditional development pattern, that organic way of growing, has its own kind of internal churn to it. At the end of World War II, we said, nope, we can't have this building up and tearing down. We can't have this redevelopment. We can't have this thickening up. We need something that will grow much, much faster. We need to hypercharge growth. And so we put all kinds of capital, all kinds of money into making that happen. And here's what happened in Fresno. 1958, 1970, 83, mid-90s. The last one I've got is 2010. It's funny because we talk a lot about the triangle. And I think it's an interesting thought exercise to go back 100 years and think of the triangle as 3 points on a, geometrically arranged. And now we don't think of it as 3 points geometrically arranged. We think of it as an area. It's a very different way of thinking about things. In my hometown, at the end of World War II, our population was 14,000. Today, our population is 14,000, but it's 10 times the size. 10 times the amount of road, 10 times the amount of pipe, 10 times the amount of the area to provide police and fire protection to. I was part of a study in Lafayette, Louisiana, where we looked at why the city was broke, why the city had no money. At the end of World War II, they had a population a little over 33,000. Today it's 120,000. They've had a 3.5 times rate of growth. This is a very robust rate of growth since the end of World War II. But if we go back and we say, what did it take to provide drinking water to the people of Lafayette? At the end of World War II, it was 5 feet of pipe per person. Today it takes 10 times that amount. What does it take to provide fire protection for the people of Lafayette? At the end of World War II, it was 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today it's 21 times that amount. So Lafayette has experienced a lot of growth. They've grown their population by 3.5 times. But in order to do that, they're growing their liabilities, the things they have to care for and maintain, by 10 times, by 20 times. You might say, okay, Chuck, that makes sense, but we're so much richer today. We're so much wealthier. We're so much better off. We've got so much more stuff. But in the city of Lafayette, and this is stuff we see in countries all over, or cities all over the country, the median family income has only grown by 1.6 times. We have systematically, because of our transportation investments and the corresponding development pattern that we have created out of it, the regulations, the approach, we have systematically denuded our cities. We've made ourselves much, much poorer. These are two identical blocks in my hometown. You'll see they're the same size, the same shape, the same area, but they're developed differently. Back in the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these three blocks. So on the left there, you see that pop-up shack. Remember I showed you that picture from the 1870s of that little shack? This is the 1920s version of that. This would have been the cheapest building you would have built on the far edge of town, hoping that over time the city would continue to grow, you would become closer to the center, the buildings would get 2 and 3 stories, would become more intense, more ornate, that kind of thing. That's not what happened. After these were built, we had the Great Depression, then we had World War II, then we had a development pattern that just skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These buildings have stagnated for over a century now. The block on the right used to look just like the one on the left. We got it torn down. We labeled it Blight. We got it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's drive-through. I realize you all don't have Taco John's. This is like Norwegian Mexican food. So if you ever visit Minnesota, give it a try. Everybody was thrilled about this, right? We got rid of Blight. We got this new thing. It's shiny and new, meets all our codes, all our ordinances. Here's what nobody bothered to look at. That old blighted block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new one, it's the same size, the same area, the same amount of public infrastructure, the same cost to the community to provide ongoing service and maintenance. Is only worth $600,000. The city's not only getting 78% more taxes from the block on the left, but that block on the left employs more people, has more local business owners. When we interviewed those business owners, they do things like bank locally, use local accountants, use local attorneys, advertise in the local paper, do all the things that make them part of a local economic ecosystem. We are responding here to the transportation investment with a regulatory regime designed to work with that. And what we are doing is we are systematically denuding the value of our neighborhoods, making ourselves physically poorer, while at the same time denuding the economic ecosystem that has made our city strong and prosperous. This is a compelling case study, but it's not a cherry-picked example. This is something we see all over North America. I'm going to show you now a series of maps put together by a friend of mine, Joe Minicozy, who lives in Asheville. His organization, Urban 3, has done productivity mapping. If you think of a farmer spreading seed across the field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. Well, where's the most productive part of the city? This is Buffalo, New York. If you've ever been to Buffalo, you've noted the decline and the neglect, particularly in the core downtown. It's not a place, it's a place that needs a lot of love. But when we say, where's the most productive parts of Buffalo? It is that stuff that was built before the Great Depression, that despite the decline, despite the neglect, has the greatest level of financial productivity. And it outperforms everything else in a way that's not even close. We see this in cities of all sizes, all geographies, all locales. We can visit northern cities, southern cities, cities on the coast, cities on the Midwest. We can visit cities that are big and small. Whenever we have that pre-Great Depression development pattern, that incrementally built and assembled way of building, those neighborhoods tend to have really, really high levels of financial productivity. Every place we see the post-war development pattern, the costs go up exponentially the further you go out, and the more spread out the development gets. And that combination makes these places very, very unproductive. I actually have this thing of Brevard that Joe put together. And I don't know Brevard. I know it's on the, it's a few hours away from here. Maybe you've been there, maybe you haven't. But here's the thing that Joe put together on this. He said, here's Brevard, here is their streets, and here's their Strode. When we're thinking about transportation investments, that's what we're talking about. And you'll note here, these things are not comparable. It's not like you're getting 10% more on your street. It's not like you're getting a slightly higher return. You are getting massive, massive levels of return. When you can build great streets, when you can thicken them up, when you have regulatory approaches that allow people to build in existing neighborhoods, redevelop, take that single family home and make it 3 units, 4 units, 5 units, when you can do those kind of things and do them easily with the least amount of regulatory friction, you can create a lot of wealth for the community very, very quickly. I mentioned Lafayette, Louisiana earlier. This is a map of Lafayette. This is actually a profit and loss map. Those other maps have been financial productivity. Where's your wealth? This is actually looking at it from the city's lens. Where do we make money? Where do we lose money? Every place you see a blue parcel is a parcel that pays more taxes and fees every year to the city than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. Every place in red is a place that requires more money to serve and maintain than it is contributing in taxes and fees. You get the pattern here, right? There's a core middle, that's the original downtown. To the right of that, to the east of that, there's a crescent of blue that runs through there. Those are the historic neighborhoods. Those places are killing it for the city. They're actually doing financially really well. I'm going to show you a photo of what these places look like because they do not look prosperous. And I had someone recently say to me, well, Chuck, the only reason the city is making money off of that is because they're neglecting the infrastructure. Our analysis actually assumed that they go out and take care of things eventually. The fact that they're not means that that blue is just higher than what we're showing on the map. What's all that red stuff? That's the malls, the strip malls, the big box stores, the gas stations, the drive-through franchise restaurants, the windy cul-de-sac-y type developments. That's all the stuff that we built the last 40, 50, 60 years. In Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family, when we did this study back in 2015, the median family pays $1,500 in taxes to the city. In order for the city to make good on the promises that they've made, to fix and maintain all this stuff, to provide police and fire protection in this entire region, the median family would need to have their taxes go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 a family makes, we need to get sent to the city just to tread water from where they're at. That's not going to happen. It will never, ever happen. And because of that, Lafayette's backlog of maintenance on just their local roads. Remember we talked at the beginning about the backlog in the national infrastructure? The state has their own massive backlog. At the local level in Lafayette, Louisiana, in the 9 years since we did this, their backlog has gone from $50 million a year to $180 million a year, or $150 million total to $180 million total, despite a more than doubling of their road budget. We have built more stuff than we can maintain. We have done it in a way that manufactures congestion. We have done it in a way that cannot continue. And we actually need to talk about how we do things much, much, much differently. I'm going to end with this. I feel like as engineers and as society, we have solved this problem. Now, I recognize I'm in a state where we just had massive flooding. But I think we also recognize that there are no engineering systems that can plan for the 10,000-year flood or whatever it was that you just experienced, right? How do we, in a normal situation, address this problem? Well, what we used to do is we used to go out and build dikes and levees and dams and try to, engineer our way out of this. And what we found over and over and over again is that we were spending ridiculous sums of money and we actually didn't solve the problem. How have we addressed this problem today? What we do today is we actually go out into the watershed and we say, you know what? You can't drain that water directly into that ditch. You can't drain that water right into the river. You actually have to retain that water on site, let it soak in, let it absorb here locally. Because when we have it all drain off, we get a flood. And the flood is ridiculously expensive to deal with. So let me ask you the question, how do we solve this problem? It's the same problem. It has the same solution. We can pretend that the answer is building more lanes, building more interchanges, opening up more land for the same type of development that is creating this congestion. Every time we do it, the congestion just gets worse. We can pretend that that's the case, but I think if we step back and look at it, we understand the only way to actually address this problem is to absorb the traffic before it gets on the roadway. We actually have to build neighborhoods. We actually have to build places where people can, yes, get in their car and go somewhere if they want, but if they also want, they can walk to go get their stuff. They can take a bike to go get their stuff. Maybe even someday they can get on a bus or a different transit system to go get something. We actually have to absorb these trips locally by building neighborhoods. I feel like there's an understanding in this room of this need to do this. I feel like there is more than an understanding in this room of how to do this. What I want you to walk away from today is an urgency of the need to do this. We have had a very dysfunctional conversation about transportation at the national level and at the state level. That is not likely to change anytime soon. We need to have a very rational, very real conversation about transportation at the local level. One that is married to a development approach that builds neighborhoods. And when we do that, not only will we find that we will spend less money, but we will get a higher return on our public investment, and we will build places that are more dynamic, more prosperous, more livable, more inviting, places that people want to move to this region to be in. And we will build cities that are much stronger and financially successful. So thank you for having me here today. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to come back. If you are interested, this conversation today took information from the middle book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, combined it with stuff from the first book, Strong Towns, Obama Revolution. I did not talk at all about the new book, the housing book that came out earlier this year. But the last time I was here, that's what the last time I was here, I gave like the first version or the second version of the housing talk. You all were really generous about it and encouraged me to go forward. So thank you, everybody.
We're gonna have a little bit of a local conversation. But as you guys get seated, if you'll oblige me for a moment. My name is Jen Truman. I'm a local designer here. I live in Raleigh. I work in Raleigh and Durham. Went to high school here at School of Science and Math in Durham, so always love to come back to my stopping grounds. But I'm gonna take a second to fangirl. Once upon a time, I was a baby civil engineering student, one of 5 girls in my graduating class in 2011, if you can believe that. And I was like, do engineers just do math in a corner all day? Do they just care about like how fast cars go? Isn't there more to life than this? And on Google, on the internet, I found this guy's blog who was talking about this stuff. So I have been a Chuck Marohn fangirl for a long time. And I'm so glad that he is here and he continues to come back to Raleigh and Durham and help us think about our place in the national conversation on housing and on transportation issues. I'm not going to read the bios of everyone on the panel. I'm gonna ask them to give us just a short intro of themselves, to say who they are and what they do during the week. You can talk about your job or your kids, your choice. But so just a very short sentence to the other folks on our panel. We'll start with Jason on the end.
Yeah, good morning. Jason Meadows. I own RDU Consulting. We are a small civil engineering firm based out of Raleigh. Predominantly serve the residential market for infill style projects, townhomes, duplexes, ADUs, types of those residential projects, predominantly in the Raleigh market. But was very honest with Evan when he asked me to join this panel. I said, hey, don't have a ton of Durham, Orange County experience, but there should be some cross-references here for municipal regulations and things of that nature that will let us gain some perspective.
Thanks, Jason. I'm D.R. Bryan with Bryan Properties, and I'm here because I'm the developer of Southern Village in Chapel Hill, and our company has mostly done single-family development in the Triangle, some in Charlotte, and some infill in Raleigh.
And I'm Chuck. You've heard enough from me, so.
Thank you, everyone, for being up here today. Chuck, thanks for laying the groundwork for us on what the national conversation is. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation around housing affordability, zoning reform, and transportation that overlap. So as I was thinking about how to frame this question and how to draw the dots between what we're doing here in Raleigh and Durham and some of your books, I wanted to kind of start at a little bit of the basics and maybe just frame, you talked a lot about how transportation and infrastructure decisions impact our housing and our affordability of our cities in general, but I'm wondering if we could be a little more specific for each panelist to say, how does that play out in our fast growing areas? Like we have, I don't know what the exact number is for Durham, maybe the mayor can help me out, but I know in Wake County we have like 50 to 60 people a day moving to the area, right? We're one of the, how many is it? 30-something, maybe more in Durham. So as a region, we're typically like 1, 2, 3, and fastest growing in the country, right? So how do these relationships that Chuck was talking about play out here locally?
Sure. It's an interesting balance, I think, specifically, like I mentioned, the Raleigh market. So I'll kind of preface my perspective purely to that. But what we've seen in the last few years with missing middle housing, adoption of a couple of text changes with additional housing options, additional densities, coupled with the frequent transit development option that Raleigh now has, as well as the transit-oriented district or transit overlay district. We're seeing some pushback, certainly from existing established neighborhoods, as we propose additional density where it has historically not been located. So we have the opportunity by right in Raleigh to build townhomes, ADUs, additional duplex density, and things of that nature in existing single-family built environments. What that has resulted in is certainly some pushback from neighborhoods, some appeals, some lawsuits. So we're trying to mitigate all of those issues from a development perspective as well as an engineering perspective. I do see frequent transit becoming certainly a great tool in the toolbox, if you will, but the neighborhood and the neighbors carry a very big stick when it comes to politics, and that's really what we're running up against. So I will say in the last couple years, Raleigh has done a really good job more informing those neighborhoods and those folks about missing middle housing, about the need for it. Pat Young has done a fantastic job sharing some of the statistics lately that have shown the uptake in additional units to try to curb the housing supply issue. And then also further demonstrating and educating folks more about missing middle. There was a large push to involve more public constituents in certain specific neighborhoods, and I think that was a lengthy process, but ultimately it resulted in a positive aspect to those neighbors as far as what opportunities they could have in their own neighborhood to grow and build more sense of community, which I think missing middle has sometimes can have a poor nomenclature associated with it, just purely from the fact of density. But if we do not have the opportunity to build density in these areas, we will not have transit infrastructure that is viable for a long-term need. So it really has to just come from our regulatory environment, from our local politics, and from our local municipalities to continue to uphold the policies that they think are important and allow us to address those in a responsible manner as best as we can.
I'd say one of the things that's happened in Chapel Hill is about 15 years ago, the town council created a zoning district called Blue Hill District, and it was a little bit less than 200 acres, I believe, and mostly an area with some fairly rundown hotels, shopping centers, mostly one-story shopping centers, two-story hotels, and changed the code there to be a form-based code so that the buildings that could be built, the zoning had heights and massing, siding requirements, but not it could be different uses. So that passed, and then a few things got torn down. It was mostly multi-story, mid-level apartment buildings were built. There was a fairly large pushback in town. Most people who lived in town did not like it, and a lot of people hated it. And when it was coming up, it was a little bit like adolescence. It was kind of gangly. And in the past election, local election last fall, there was a slate of candidates who ran for the mayor and 4 council members to say we hate we hate Blue Hill and we don't like it. And those candidates all but one lost. The mayor, one running for mayor, and 3 of the 4 lost. And so now there's a bigger push to include that. I'll say what you were looking at, Chuck, on the local streets. This is taking some of that Strodes and maybe and the infrastructure is actually being built by the developers who are creating value with the more intense use. So that's just an example of something I think has happened in a positive way.
So let me make this observation at a distance, understanding that there's local nuance here that you grasp that I don't. It feels like a lot of the air in the room is taken up, talking about what is the next big transportation project that we do, what is the next thing with 9 digits on it that we're going to do. And I see that as, again, I'm going to go back to, why do we rob banks? Because that's where the money is. We have a housing problem. The way we solve the housing problem is to build more transportation, because that will open up more land for development so that we can build, so that we can solve the housing problem. All of a sudden, our housing problem becomes a transportation problem. And that sucks up not only the time that our elected officials are spending in meetings, but our staff time and our community conversation and our dialogue is not on actually addressing the housing problem. It's on addressing the transportation problem that we think will help solve the housing problem. I have said many, many times that I think city halls should have half as many technical people, half as many engineers and planners as they do today, and 4 times as many social workers as they do today. Because the problems we need to work out are not the technical problems of like where the next highway should go and where the next interchange should be and what that should be zoned and how we get the sewer and water there. We should actually be done with most of those problems. The problem we have now is how do we make better use of the stuff we have? And how do we do it in a way that is both honest to our fiscal situation, but also recognizes the fact that we made promises to people that we can't keep. A big part of our resistance to the new development is basically when we build a neighborhood of single-family homes, we promised you it would always be single-family homes. And that will never change, and that will never be different. And the reality is that that's not a promise that we can keep. Fiscally, we can't keep. There's not enough tax base there to actually sustain the developments people are living in. So the missing middle housing, the infill housing, the idea that we're going to have apartments, that we're going to have duplexes, triplexes, quad units, these things require, I mean, I just looked at your silly flag lot thing that should be an over-the-counter permit that you're now in month like 18 of trying to get approved, Evan. These are things that require us to talk to each other, not through forms and committees, but as humans. And that's why I do think that the emphasis at City Hall needs to shift from not what is the next thing that we're doing to how do we make better use of what we have. And to do that, you actually need a different skill set. And it looks less like an engineer and a planner, and it looks a lot more like a social worker, because it's really dealing with human messiness.
I think that's a valuable sort of like shift in perspective, and leads to the next question.
Says one engineer to another.
Architecture school changes you.
Yeah.
What I notice when we're talking about developments, either as designers and engineers or developers, we get in the nitty-gritty details often, and that translates to city council meetings. So often you'll go for a rezoning or you'll go in for a permit review, and all of a sudden the conversation is about where the fire truck can go, right? How wide is it? Or more recently in our fast-growing area is how does the developer pay for the new bus shelter or the new bus stop or the new transit center or the new fire truck to reach the building that they're trying to do, right? Like that's the level of conversation that we're having in terms of infrastructure investment. It's magnified in the news that we see about Western North Carolina, how critical that infrastructure is because the disaster has put it in front of us, right? But it's true here how critical that infrastructure is, and it's a balance sheet problem. So the next couple questions get into that like a little bit of detail because I don't think that people in the public appreciate how many details there are always in these projects, but we as designers of course do. But how do we find that balance and that human touch amongst all of those details? Like what are the kind of steps that the local governments, because I know we've got municipal leaders and electeds and staff here, or developers and builders that are in the room, how do we balance that infrastructure cost conversation with what makes housing possible to produce, that makes mixed-use neighborhoods possible to produce, that make these things possible? And I know that's a big question, but if we could just like talk for a second about where those pieces are. I'm going to give it to Chuck first because he already talks about this.
I'll say this as a way to, I think, set the two of you up, hopefully. If you are going to be a developer of land, you have to be a Renaissance person, right? I mean, look at the skill set involved. You've got to be able to talk to bankers and do pro formas and understand the finance. And you've got to be able to understand cash flow and cash flow projections and the impact of interest rates because you're doing multiple things at one time over time. You have to be able to navigate a regulatory process. You've got to be able to apply for permits, have multiple permit applications going at once, be working on multiple deals at the same time in order to move things ahead. You've got to be tactical in how you do it. You've got to have human connection. You also have to understand phasing of buildings, how to work with plumbers, how to work with electricians. You've got so many different things going on. I think oftentimes as engineers, as planners, we look at this as like simple, more simple than it actually is. I think that if we had more, if we gave developers, in a sense, a little bit bigger playbox to play in, a little bit bigger sandbox to work in, we would find some of them would screw it up because some of them are idiots, and a rising tide has raised some really not very good boats. But, and I realize I say that in a room, you all know developers who are like, what is this, but I do think that, particularly during a time of slowdown or a time of changing shift, I think what you will see is that the really, really good ones step up and we identify who they are and we've given them enough room to actually do stuff. As we're walking through your development yesterday and I'm listening to you describe, how you handle this topography and how you lay the street out and all this, and then having struggles over the regulatory issues of street slopes and different things, even the one where you had the parking out in front of the building because of the silly rules about backing out into a street where there's no traffic. These are things that I would love to see you be able to trial and error figure out and build that kind of industry knowledge, as opposed to a regulator and try, like I've done the regulation business. That's what I did, for a decade of my career. A regulator pretending that somehow they understand all the things that you're doing. There's a need to protect the public interest. I get that. But I feel like that has become more rote and less thinking than it really should be. And because of that, we tend to often get rote, unthinking plans and developments instead of stuff that is really innovative and will add a lot of value.
Sort of the same, similar question back over to DR. It's a great transition. Like, I'm curious about that partnership or lack thereof between the local government. You can talk specifically about Southern Village or other projects. Like, what does that feel like on the ground when you're working those out? Does it feel like what Chuck's describing, or less, a little more painful?
Well, speaking of Southern Village and Chapel Hill in particular, for those of you who were not there yesterday, one of the things we talked about was the town first came up with the idea of, well, and first of all, Chuck, I want to tell you, my background's in social work.
Oh, really? Okay. That makes sense to me.
So,
But
yeah.
you see what I'm saying, though, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah.
So I only did it for a year out of college, but that was my undergraduate degree.
I think people think, when I say social worker, they think about like Mother Teresa. And what I'm really talking about, as a social worker, you have to actually understand humans, human interactions, how things work. It is a background that is different than a deep technical pursuit, right?
Right. It's broader.
Yes.
So anyway, Southern Village, the town decided they wanted to have a walkable, more dense community on 300 acres on the south side of town. So broker brought the land to me and said, "You want to look at this?" And I was familiar with Seaside in Florida, knew the concepts. So immediately started looking at the ordinance, and so sat down with the town manager and said, we'd love to do something like this. We cannot use the ordinance that you have. He took the ordinance, put it on the shelf, and said, okay, you come back and tell me what you want to do, and we'll talk about it. So my engineer partner and I actually ended up looking in Winston-Salem at West End, which is a similar topography about a mile west of downtown Winston-Salem that was developed between 1890 and 1920. And we went back and measured street widths, vertical curves, horizontal curves, K values. When I say we, he did that because I still don't understand what a K value is. But that's what we did. We reverse engineered everything, came back, designed the first phase of Southern Village using the same standards people used in 1895, 1900. And he said, all right, we'll let you try that for this first phase, see what happens. So all but one, we had one street that I think was 15% slope going down that he said, you can't do that anymore. And maybe we had to cut it back to 13. But other than that, everything that we used, we created our own pattern and our own rules. And so the fact that he did bring the book back off the shelf, and we had to meet with the engineering department and got spanked a little bit here and there. But anyway, we were able to do that, and otherwise we would have never been able to develop it. It would be, we'd have the wide streets that you were talking about and no street trees, which back at that time, the Green Book, it was the book used in North Carolina, and trees were considered FHOs.
Fixed
Hazardous
objects.
Fixed hazardous objects. So that's what they call trees. You couldn't have FHOs within 50 feet or so of the street. So anyway, it was a lot of fun learning about those things.
I'm going to point out one thing. A person walking or a person on a bike or someone pushing a stroller is not an FHO because they will break away if a car goes off the road and hits them. And that is the honest, that will make your stomach turn when you think about it too much. But that's actually how we build. We should have bollards along every street because every time you've got a car driving at a lethal speed and you've got a person walking 2 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet away from them, it's a really hazardous situation. But our engineering manuals would call bollards a fixed hazardous object. You can't do it. Yeah.
And just for our modern planners in the room, if you can put a bollard there, you can put a tree there.
Yeah. Or vice versa.
Jason, I want to get your perspective on this kind of conversation and maybe ask you, I wanted to ask you about like a little more detail. I think in your practice, you're working with incremental developers. You're really pushing the boundaries on how you interact with the fire department and the stormwater department. So I'm wondering if you could just push a little bit into the weeds as you answer.
Yeah. In general, there's quite a few site constraints that we have to consider. It starts as early as what are the units, what is the market that we're trying to sell to, and this is all, developer led. I react to those types of conversations, but ultimately, your access needs, how you handle solid waste, how you're handling fire apparatus access in and around the development. Which I understand is going to change here in the next year or so with apparatus, aerial apparatus access. So ladder trucks, for example, if you have anything over 3 stories or 30 feet. So we're constantly trying to look ahead at what those issues are. But to the specifics about the efficiencies and economics of it, we basically have to capture every square foot of new impervious and treat that with stormwater. So when we think about public streets versus private alleys, much different conversation. We would also always prefer to build a 22 to 24 foot private alley versus a 55 foot, minimum right-of-way public street with sidewalks on both sides, street trees, and everything that goes along with a public street section. But ultimately, there's quite a few municipalities who have not addressed the issue of lots not fronting on public streets. Raleigh changed that recently. Wendell has made a change very recently as well. But there's always a limiting factor that says, well, we don't want your alley to be more than X feet long, or we don't want you to be more than X feet away from your public intersection, which prohibits your, let's call it garden townhome type development that you would see from the 70s and 80s. So there is a massive public street cutting through your development. There are block perimeter issues that we deal with. There are cross-access issues that we deal with, which results in more width to your street sections versus what you simply need for your smaller community. So that is probably the biggest issue is private streets are frowned upon from a regulatory standpoint for whatever reason. I don't know how we arrive at exactly how long we feel like an alley can or should be before it needs to be a public street. But that is something that, as you consider, long-term infrastructure costs like Chuck speaks to, those streets, those alleys, for example, are not publicly maintained items. So that's up to the private development to continue to maintain. So that is also something that is considered from a development type standpoint is, can the HOA support this improvement that we are burdening them with for X many years, or maybe that project lives 75 years or so, like can they afford to maintain this as well? And I think fiscally the private side hopefully does a little bit better preparing for those types of things, as Chuck has statistics for. But those are all the things that we think about. Every square foot of additional impervious, whether it be a structure or a road, we have to treat. So we want to keep things as small and as dense as we can. As we think about vehicles and how we address current vehicular needs and auto-centric type development, which is maybe possibly a political term that's used as well. But in our market, we're just not ready yet for the transit to take over. We still need our vehicles. We're still building against collectors that don't have sidewalks. So even if we build a development internal adjacent to a collector, we build sidewalks for people to access, but they have nowhere to go. So more neighborhood-centric type retail restaurant, which I think is exactly how Chuck concluded his presentation, is we need to start building within our neighborhoods those personal services, retail and restaurant uses, so that we don't have to get in a car and go 5 miles to get to a shopping center and things like that. So that was a little bit off topic of the question, but I think ultimately that's exactly the conversation that is had with almost every project at the due diligence phase is how do we address it? What are the requirements? Are we looking at off-site improvements, right-of-way dedication, which takes land? Some of your municipal density is calculated on a net site area basis. So if we are required to have a public street for the development for whatever reason, whether it be to connect to an adjoining block or lot or even stub, that sacrifices density. So if we can't build density, we can't really afford to invest in certain levels of infrastructure that may be needed from the private perspective as well. So that's a lot about kind of the ins and outs of it, which a lot of you probably know, but I think it's worth speaking more about, and I would encourage everyone to get involved with the political side of things, which I've been forced to here lately to kind of grow the business and grow the opportunities for the folks that I work for, as relying on the Wake HBA as well for some of these new things coming up, new stormwater manual, new street sections, but just a thought about how some of this works. I'll give a specific example. We had a small residential project of approximately 10 units. The city asked for additional right-of-way dedication and a fee in lieu for street widening. Meanwhile, they had a completely funded traffic calming project that went into the street that we were required to give additional right-of-way for and pay for additional pavement width for, and they built a median in the center of the street for traffic calming purposes. So meanwhile, requiring developments to provide additional right-of-way width and pay for wider streets, meanwhile making them narrower for the purposes of safety. It just seems a contradictory approach, but we're just not there yet. A lot of these things don't blend well together, and I think we just need, all of us in the room are responsible for hopefully taking this forward and making a lot better decisions about how to be responsible with these developments and the long-term goals of the municipalities that we work within.
That perspective is really appreciated because I can also feel deeply the wanting to be in the weeds and getting projects built and also needing to advocate at the same time. I think a lot of designers are not feeling that. I'm going to ask you guys to oblige me one more time. I got a text that the mayor of Durham would like to ask a question. So we're going to go off book and let him ask a question first. And then we'll do one more panel question before I open it to everyone. Do you want to come up here? Or you want to project?
Just real quick, Chuck, you need to write another book because this conversation is amongst practitioners in the room, and I don't live in that space. I live in the middle space between the comfort of residents and the practice of practitioners. And we're having these conversations in very different spaces. So this could be a rhetorical question, but I'd love to start hearing how we can better communicate what it is that must happen with what you all are doing and translating that to the residents who say, look, when I go out at 4:45, it's just too much traffic on the road, and that needs to change. So we need more lanes. What I got from this today was a lot of logic, a lot of common sense, a lot of, it's very pragmatic. But we have elected officials. I'm a music teacher and now sell chicken for a living. But I am making decisions on topography. I'm making decisions on very technical things. I have a team of experts that have made their life commitment to do this technical work. You guys do all of the preparation and you come to a board like myself who sells chicken for a living. And I have to make a decision as technical as they are prepared to do, based on people who come in and project their convenience or desire for their convenience. And I don't think that we're talking enough in that space, because be in your career all you want. You can prepare all of this stuff. You come to City Hall, and it's a lot of wasted money and a waste of time. Because you're coming to get a decision that your investment is relying on. Your investment is what I'm relying on to build and grow my city the right way. And so I do think if we keep having these conversations in two separate venues and not face the monster of bringing these folks together, we're going to keep talking about the issue and not do a damn thing about it. So I don't know what that question is, but hopefully we can start.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's good. I just wanted to say that's what's missing, and I hope we can discuss this.
Thank you for the question and the comment, and for being one of our local politicians who's always willing to stand up and say that in both rooms. I've heard you say it to the neighbors, and I've heard you say it to the builders. It's a rare breed, and we know that it comes with its scars. I'll let Chuck kind of briefly go at this, because Mayor Williams has already heard my answer to this question.
Thank you. And the work that you do is really, really hard. And I appreciate you taking the time to be here and to chat with people. I feel like the universal language of these two different spaces is the finance. And I think that the way that I would push it internally with your team is to say we need to be very honest with people about the numbers. A lot of times cities and city staffs will try to downplay the financial part, and they'll have these huge gaps in their budget that they'll say someone else will solve this in the future, or the federal government will come in and help, or the state will help, or we'll get funding or a grant. I think if we are more honest with ourselves about our own financial situation, it will allow us to be more honest with people. A lot of what we're communicating is people have lobster tastes and hamburger budgets. And I think if we're honest about the hamburger budget we have, we can be honest about our lobster tastes and say, we can solve this congestion problem, but here's how much this is going to cost for people. And as the mayor, I can't responsibly spend that money because we just don't have it. We have to take care of this, this, and this. And I feel like the finance is the gap. That's how we bridge that gap. Thank you.
Did you guys want to add anything on that end?
Yeah, I'll just say something real quick. If anyone's ever been to a neighborhood meeting for rezoning or something like that, where we sit opposite table from residents that we're probably building next to, that is a micro example of the bigger conversation that really needs to be had. Is the reason that we are here is because we have businesses to run and mouths to feed and employees and things of that nature, and we're trying to make a living at it. But it is the development side is always seen with a negative connotation because of the type of work and where it has to be located and things like that. So if there is a way to bring some kind of consensus or some ultimate goal with more community outreach, I think that's exactly what it's going to take. We have I don't know about specific to Durham, but Raleigh has community ambassadors. So there's no longer a voting neighborhood type environment other than the neighborhood meeting. But those community ambassadors should be those people that are directly involved in that community where the rezonings are occurring. And I think that is a face for the residents to say, hey, I don't like this. I don't want this in my neighborhood. And hopefully those community ambassadors can speak to the reasons that we have to continue to provide additional housing and provide additional density for a relative affordability of those units. I think that's something that the developers say, and we say it often. I say it on behalf of whom I work for, but it doesn't mean as much, coming directly from our side of the table. That's right.
I'd just like to add that Durham 35 years ago was a leader in redeveloping downtown and bringing people back, and y'all just done a fabulous job. I mean, it's a model for the country. And I saw Aaron sitting beside you there earlier, and I know, Aaron, you were working on trying to eliminate the downtown loop, and I forgot it was some 10 or 12 acres could be opened up for housing. So maybe before you leave office.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give a little bit of a shameless plug, and this is why Mayor Williams has already heard my answer. The thing that makes the difference is neighbors who are willing to come to public meetings, not just to complain, but to say, yes, we want this. The YIMBY movement is seeing a national moment because the presidential candidates noticed us in all of our little tiny towns. But I will say that we now have a YIMBY chapter here in the Triangle in Raleigh and Durham. It's yesinmytriangle.org, and we will be organizing neighbors to come and support projects, but more importantly, to support the policies that mean that people don't have to come to council to ask to build housing. So we will be coming to support text changes and policy changes and zoning reforms, like the ones we already have, but we know that we need many more. So that is my moment as moderator for a shameless plug, to say that every single person who wants a walkable neighborhood or a different house for their friends to not have to move out to Zebulon or Wendell or Creedmoor or Pittsboro or Dunn or any of those places and wants to live in Chapel Hill and in Durham and in Raleigh, those people showing up at meetings are the people that are going to make the difference. Because I think many of us have stood in those rooms being the only person for too long, and we know there are more people. They're just scared to come to meetings. So we're trying to organize that locally. And with that positive look, I'm going to go to my last question that I had, which was, we know that people want walkable communities. We know that people want to be able to go to the coffee shop or the barber shop, the mixed use, like we built it in 1920 neighborhood. And the biggest thing that comes up in all of those public meetings is, but our infrastructure only supports single family homes. How can I let you put that coffee shop where on the corner of the neighborhood with single family homes? And I just wonder if we could speak to, like, looking to the future and those demographic trends, do you have something positive to focus on when we come to this infrastructure question and this desire that people have to live in more vibrant neighborhoods like Southern Village? Wouldn't it be nice if every neighborhood was like that?
So, I've heard this argument before, and I find it to be technically absurd. Do you know how much sewage goes through an 8-inch pipe? I mean, just like insane amounts. And we don't put smaller pipes in the ground than that. If they're saying like the roads won't handle it or there's not enough parking, I'm again, your local streets do not have a congestion problem. It's the fact that you channel it all to the collectors and the arterials that creates the problem. And the solution to that is to actually make better use of your infrastructure. I feel like I've heard technical people make this argument, and I feel like what you are hearing is what a moral psychologist or like Jonathan Haidt would say is just motivated reasoning. I have an answer. The answer is no, I don't want to do this. And so now I'm going to look for every reason that I can. And the last resort that I cling to is the technical argument, because it's a cudgel I have over you, because you're not a technical person and I am. And it's frustrating for me because it is almost always a dumb argument, a really dumb argument. To me, if I had technical people who are making that argument, I would find different technical people. If I was, if they worked for me. If they didn't work for me, if they worked for the city, I would encourage the city to find different technical people to get advice from. Yeah.
I appreciate the honest answer.
Totally agree with Chuck as far as infrastructure being there, but what is missing for those corner coffee shops or cafes is the density in the single family. So you've got to have density design, so you've got to be able to have a friendly walk to that space, and then the mixed use or designation just have another D. So density, designation, and design. And of those three, probably design is the most important, but density, if you don't have enough rooftops within a 10-minute walk, your coffee shop's gonna not make it. And that's from personal experience.
Yeah.
I think the biggest positive outlook that I have extends from the relationships that I've been able to build with the local government staff as well as the politics, and sharing the perspective. We had a really good conversation this week with a small committee in Raleigh where we literally said, we need you to help us keep a certain development pattern viable. And they said, well, tell us more about the financials of that. Tell us more about why it doesn't work under the current rules. And we had a fantastic conversation. We went through the land basis and all the fixed costs that go into development and selling at dollars per square foot, how that all shakes out. And it was extremely well received, and there will be follow-up communication based on that. But just in general, how we're a couple years old in Raleigh with missing middle. Durham has, I think, had extreme success out of some other opportunities that are available in Durham that we haven't yet migrated elsewhere. But you see the positive aspects of it from density uptake and relative affordability, and allowing folks to stay in the neighborhoods that they possibly grew up in. So those are all things that make me excited, and even though it's incredibly difficult to cut through the regulatory red tape, I still wake up every day and try to do the best that I can do to meet the goals of the communities that I work in. So that's really what gets me excited and keeps me going in what I do. Otherwise, I would probably find something else to do. So thank y'all.
Thank you to the panel for being here. We do, I think, have maybe a few minutes to take one or two questions. If there are other folks that have questions, I see one up front.
I'm serving in my fourth term on the council, served 4 years as mayor pro tem. And just real quickly, Morrisville is really having housing costs go up. I mean, and the biggest problem is the political courage. Right now, it's almost like a dirty word in our town for rezonings for multifamily, because the residents say it's more traffic, you're overcrowding the schools. So we just tabled a rezoning in Park West, which is one of our shopping centers that's about to go out of business. And we negotiated 240 units, 15% over 30 years. But then the council switched their vote. It was a no vote because they don't want more apartments. So I just need your all's help. What I've encouraged everybody on my council is to have the courage to do the right thing. I voted for rezonings my last time, and everyone said I wouldn't get reelected, and I led the ticket. But if you keep waiting for the next thing, so I just want to know, what can you do to equip my colleagues on the council to look at this as an equity and inclusivity issue and an economic development issue, rather than just not in my backyard issue. So sorry I went over my time with my rant, but I saved the day because they were about to vote it down, and then they would have been denied the rezoning, and then they would go out of business in about 3 months.
The places that have done this the best are places that have local groups that show up. And you brought this up too. We've started supporting this program called Local Conversations. So there's 240 some strong towns groups around the country. There isn't one here, but there needs to be ultimately. Raleigh has one. Thank you. I do. The idea of these groups is partially when the NIMBYs, when the people oppose the project show up, they are representing a certain pain that they experience when there's a little bit more traffic, or there's a few more people in the park, or it's harder to find a place to park. And the thing is, let's be honest, those are real pains. Those are real pains that they experience. What is not being represented is the real pain of not being able to find a house, not being able to find an affordable place to live, having to pay way more than what you can afford to get into a place. And that is a huge pain, a pain that far outweighs the inconvenience of having to walk half a block. What happens in our dialogue is that little pain is being magnified and the large pain is not showing up and being there. And so part of bridging this gap is getting people who are experiencing that pain or can represent that pain to show up and actually speak toward it. I don't feel like it. You use the word courage, and I think there is a certain amount of courage, but the way we give leadership courage is to actually represent the pain that they are trying to solve, right? In the absence of that, the line between courage and madness is not clear.
And tell me afterwards when the next meeting is, and we'll see if we can get some people to show up. We'll give you the practical answer. Are there other questions? Uh-oh. Now we got to pick. Let's see.
I'm on this side.
This side wins. I can't walk. Evan has to be my legs.
Hi, Melissa McCullough, Town of Chapel Hill Town Council. I was at the Bike Walk Summit a few weeks ago, and there was a great conversation about safety. And while y'all touched on it some as a byproduct, the thrust of that conversation was very much about safety as being a very effective communication tool and vehicle, and a way to hit home for people who might not pay attention to climate or whatever. I'm wondering what y'all think about that and how we can incorporate that into these discussions more.
I can give you the strong towns. So one of the tricks with safety is that engineers believe in their hearts that they put safety first and foremost. And they have lots and lots of technical manuals that support that assertion. What I spent a great deal of the presentation today is explaining why those things are actually not safe. And so the safety conversation that we need to have is actually a recalibration of what it means to build something that is safe. And when I took a moment earlier to say, having the hazardous object of a tree be identified as something we can get rid of, but having the person walking down the street who is a human being not bother in fact, the engineer designs them to be there with a sidewalk. The fact that that doesn't bother us because they will break away if we hit them, like literally, unlike a tree, they won't damage the driver physically, to me is one of those things that should make us uncomfortable. And we have to have some of those uncomfortable conversations when we're reframing the idea of safety, because engineers have all the answers on safety and they're almost all wrong. On local streets. On highways, they're genius.
I'll add another safety point. This is in the original Strong Towns book, so I encourage y'all to read the original Strong Towns book if you haven't. But we build a lot of single-family homes on the periphery of development, out, where people are looking for privacy, they're looking for not seeing their neighbors, and a lot of trees and solitary development pattern. But we also see a lot of targeted break-ins with that type of property, because it's very easy to target a house that's basically shrouded in darkness every night. I love the eyes on the street metaphor, and I think that's another powerful thing that we can talk about in terms of community safety. There is a safety in numbers, and there is a vulnerability in being isolated. And so when people think of density, they sometimes think of it as being crime-ridden. But I actually feel safer on my street, where I've got 6 or 7 houses that I can see from my front porch, because I know that they're looking out, I'm looking out, and I'm also just less likely to be targeted. So that's another recalibration of safety that I think often gets tangled up in the single-family home debate.
I think that it's 11:02, so I think that we will get down off the stage and talk about questions with anyone who has the time to hang out. We really appreciate you being here today. Evan, is there anything that you would like folks to know before they head back?
No, that's it. I appreciate everyone being here and appreciate the panel.
Thank you all.
Very, very happy to have you all.